Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Danuta Nietetsky. I'm Dean of the Drexel Libraries, and I really want to thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar, Voting Outside the Polling Place, with Professor William Rosenberg from Drexel's Political Science Department. So this session is part of Countdown to Vote, which is only 3 weeks away, folks, the library's newest series of webinars that focus on different topics related to voting and elections. Through these sessions, we seek to engage the Drexel community and our neighbors across Pennsylvania with important issues related to elections and voting in order to help navigate the upcoming presidential election. Upcoming sessions will address topics such as what exactly is the Electoral College and how can election reform change how people run for office, vote, and win. You'll find more information about our Countdown to Vote series on our website, www.library.drexel.edu. We hope you'll attend all of our webinars and stay tuned for announcements about other sessions we're already planning to host, perhaps, following the November 3rd election. Today, I'm pleased to welcome Professor Rosenberg as the guest speaker for our first Countdown to Vote session. Professor Rosenberg is the author of over 80 articles, papers, and technical reports, and he is a co-author of 2 books related to public opinion and public policy. One is entitled News, Verdicts, the Debates and Presidential Campaigns, and the other, The Politics of Disenchantment, Bush, Clinton, Perot, and the Press. He is a well-known expert in the presidential election process, as well as topics on public opinion and media related to the campaigns. So thank you very much, Bill, for joining us today. But before I turn the Zoom controls over to Professor Rosenberg, I want to run through a few logistics. First, please keep yourself muted during the presentation. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end of the session. We're recording this presentation and we will post the recording on the library's YouTube channel later today. Following the webinar, all attendees will receive an email with a link to the video and a link to a very short survey. We would really love to hear your feedback about this session and ideas for future ones. Finally, I wanted to share a reminder that Monday, October 19th, next Monday, is the last day to register to vote in Pennsylvania. To check voter registration deadlines in your state and for other information related to voting and elections, visit the Drexel Library's Drexel Votes Resource Guide, prepared by Kathleen Turner, one of our librarians. There's a link to the guide in the chat box. And I also want to give a shout out to 2 other folks. John Wiggins, you can see him here. He's our director for library services, and Stacy Stanislav, who is our communication manager. They have very quickly pulled together this series and made the arrangements for them. And so now, without further ado, I welcome Professor Rosenberg. It's all yours, Bill.
Okay, thank you. So as Danuta has mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about the election, and I'm going to specifically be talking about things that happen outside the polling place, including vote by mail, absentee voting, and other at-home options, and also give you a little bit of the history as well as the strategy that's going on this election in terms of these types of voting mechanisms. So let me just see. So yes, you still can go to the polling station on election day and cast your ballot as you've always done, or if you've never voted before, do it for the first time, as long as you're registered to vote. However, many may choose another alternative due to COVID, personal convenience, or simply a goal to get their vote on the record as early as possible. So I put 4 very public options that are there. The one on the left is when you actually go into the voting polling station and you get the ballot, whether it's a machine ballot or a paper ballot. The drop boxes that you've seen quite a bit of controversy around the country on, where you can go and drop your ballot into a box which looks a little bit like a post office box, and they're collected. You can do mail by vote, which is what I have as the 3rd option there. And then you could also do early voting. Many states allow you to go to the polling booth polling station or to a county board of elections ahead of time and cast your ballot. One of the things we have to realize, though, is that elections in the United States are really like a patch-made quilt. The election for the President of the United States is a non-gift from the Founding Fathers. What they did was they allowed the states to regulate how elections were going to be held, although it's kind of ironic because the states are not what we're electing. We're electing a president of all the United States. And the reason why this is so confusing for many when you watch the news is that each state has different rules, different regulations, different policies that are put in place. And that's why I put this little illusion of a quilt. If we go back and also look at who actually goes out to vote, this happens to be from the Biden campaign, but it's factually correct. If you look at 2016, almost 66 million people voted for Hillary Clinton. 63 million voted for Donald Trump. About 7 million voted for other people. And 100 million people did not vote. So when we talk about the election, we have to realize that we could talk about everyone who's over 18, or we could talk about everyone who is registered to vote, or we can talk about everyone who actually casts a ballot, and those are all different numbers. Much of what we look for in an election is not just to have Democrats and Republicans turn out, but to have independents or people that were not participants in the past show up and vote on election day. So in the 2020 election, the presidential process poses a variety of mechanisms to vote. I already showed you 4 of them. And this has become quite politicized in this year, but this politicization is not really new. And I'm going to go through a little bit of that in a minute. But there's also currently a discussion about absentee ballots, early voting, mail-in ballots, internet voting, in terms of both convenience and also potential fraud. And we'll cover that a little bit as well. So just to use some historical similarities, because a lot of this has to do with opening up the electorate, I pose 4 particular examples that one should consider here. One is in 1865, the right to vote for African American men, the 15th Amendment was passed that enlarged the electorate. Notice that it was only for African American men, not African American women. In 1920, there was the right to vote extended to white women. Up until then, 1920, white women were not allowed to vote, and that was the 19th Amendment. In 1964, the Voting Rights Act provided protections primarily for African American votes. And in 1971, for some of the older participants in the room, that's when 18-year-olds first got to vote. And that was the 26th Amendment. All of those carried with it great debate. For example, in 1971, would all of those young people all vote for the Democrat? Because the war in Vietnam was raging, and maybe that could change the outcome of an election. So when we take a look at what's going on now in 2020, you see a lot of the discussion about what states are likely to go which ways and where is there going to be more restrictive parameters put on when people can register, how they can cast their ballot, how they're going to be counted, what type of identification has to be present. So these are not necessarily new things. They've been happening for a long time. So when we deal with the verification of votes at the polls, we're really trying to prevent fraud. All votes have to be verified, though, in order to be counted. But the states have different ways of doing this. You could present an ID and be asked to sign a registration roll book, and then that's compared by a poll worker to see whether or not your signature matches the one that's on record. For mail voting, the main means to prevent fraud is by verifying the ballot itself. This includes personal identifying such things as an address, a birthday, a driver's license number, or your last 4 digits of your social security number. And then finally, your signature is reviewed. And sometimes a second person has to sign it as well to confirm you are who you say you are. So there's a lot of mechanisms put in place, but they're by no means universal. Different states have different ways of doing it. In terms of verifying a mail-in ballot, the main, I already have that one, so we'll go over that. The absentee ballot issue is another issue that we should think about. And there is this discussion about absentee ballots and mail-in ballots. So following the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, we started to use absentee ballots actually in greater numbers during the Civil War. And that allowed soldiers deployed away from home to be able to cast their ballots. Because let's say they're from Massachusetts, but they're fighting down in Virginia. They're not going to go home on election day to vote. So it gives them the mechanism. A modern example of that would be, let's say you're a submariner today and you're under the Pacific Ocean. Your submarine's not going to surface and take you back to Philadelphia to vote. So you have to have a way of being able to cast your ballot. 1862, Wisconsin created absentee ballot legislation. Again, it was for all qualified white electors. And the idea was that it was a way to get soldiers to be able to vote. So while some states followed this model, some Democratic states decided not to pass such legislation to suppress the votes of soldiers who many feared would vote more likely in the Republican camp and thus Lincoln's party. So they sort of worked as a bulwark to prevent absentee ballots. But post-Civil War, states often moved to allow more absentee ballots beyond just soldiers. In 1924, 45 of our 48 states adopted absentee ballots in some way, and today all 50 states do, although in some states an excuse is required. We're going to see some states today require no reason to have an excuse. And this is presented in this graphic right here. You can see the green is you can vote by mail, and essentially that would be either a mail by vote or an absentee ballot, really, where you are going to send in your vote. But in a universal mail vote by mail situation, you don't really ever have to provide an explanation because it's simply sent to you. But you can see that for most of the country, there's no excuse required for absentee ballots. But if you do notice the South, okay, the South is mostly gray, and that's where an excuse is required. So it's kind of a suppression of the vote. These absentee ballots go by a lot of different names: advance ballots, mail ballots, by mail ballots, mail ballots, mail by, vote by mail, and so forth. But essentially, they're all involving receiving a ballot and then either mailing it back to the Board of Elections or hand delivering it into those boxes I showed you earlier. In 2020, there's been quite a controversy over the post office. And the new head of the post office, a Trump appointee, has received a lot of criticism because he was removing those large mail sorters, which was going to cut down on the processing ability of the post office. A lot of this, though, we have to realize is just very political, because the number of ballots that we're going to be processing on the period of the election in 2020 is dwarfed by the number of mail pieces and pieces of mail that happen around the December holidays. So it's really not going to be such a concern. It's really that tight window right towards the end. If you wait to the last minute to mail it in, that maybe you'll have a little bit of a problem. The big issue, though, is that the Trump campaign has argued that an absentee ballot is fine, but a mailed out ballot where every registered voter gets them is not. Okay, and again, you have to wonder why that's the case, and we're going to see about that in just a moment. The mail-in ballot is a universally mailed ballot to everyone who's registered to vote, and then it has to either be returned by the post office or dropped off. A handful of states have it so that automatically every voter in the state that's eligible without any application gets one of these. But again, you might say, well, why is there so much debate about this? Well, here's part of the reason why. So the advantages of voting by mail is that it provides convenience and satisfaction. Part of the convenience is also to avoid getting COVID by going out in public or going to a place where you have to stand in line where people may not be socially distancing, where there could be coughing or contact and so forth. There's also a financial savings because the government doesn't have to have this big staffing on election day. They can be processing the votes over a longer period of time. And there's also the advantage that it increases turnout. The research shows that when you have vote by mail, more people participate. The disadvantages, though, are the costs of printing and mailing. Remember that if it's universally mailed out, everyone gets one of these packets that's 18 or older and a registered voter. There's also what's called residual votes. Those are when we have a voter mark more than one thing on the voting ballot. And these can often be fixed by a voter, like a poll watcher on election day, so that those are removed, not to change their vote, but just to make sure that it looks right. There's also the tradition that's been in place for a couple of 100 years that if we go to vote by mail, there's a lack of civic experience. You don't go and vote with your friends and neighbors. You're just doing it sort of in an anonymous way. There's a difference in terms of impact, in terms of mail delivery, moving literacy of the individuals, which causes problems. There's also the opportunity for coercion, in the sense that if you have a person at their home and somebody comes over and starts really leaning on them, saying, where's your ballot? Let's vote it together. Oh, let me show you how to do it. That's different than the secret ballot that you have on election day at the polling station. The last disadvantage, though, I think is a really big one. It's slower result reporting. And you're going to see in a moment, I have a couple of slides that show the variation between states on this matter. So why would Trump want to oppose universal mail-in voting? Well, I'm going to suggest 3 reasons. One is he may want to sow seeds of distrust in the electoral process and claim essentially that it was not a fair election. He may feel that those who vote by mail are more likely not to support him, so thus he would like to not get those votes counted. And Trump also argues that there may be more corruption when actually the results don't demonstrate that. But there is the possibility that you could have a person leaning on another trying to get them to vote in this way. Utah, a Republican conservative state, has been doing basically all of their voting by mail for at least 10 years now. And they claim that they have virtually no voter fraud at all. So it's kind of a political hot potato that's bouncing back between the Trump administration, or Donald Trump himself, and the other actors in the political arena. But another issue is that all of you are familiar with the big wall, say like on CNN or MSNBC or whatever, where you have people like John King up there showing you how the votes are coming in. Well, the problem with this mail-in voting is that on election day, unless you voted at the polls and they were immediately counted, all the votes are not in. So Donald Trump, some would argue, is hoping that his votes get counted on election day and show him as the winner, and then he's going to declare a victory. He's already described the fact that he may not be willing to turn over power very easily. that he's just going to be operating in a process of transition to another 4 years. Well, elections have always been not all election votes are cast and counted on election day. But now with, in some states, 35 or 40% of the public voting either early or by mail or by absentee, we're having less and less votes counted and called in on election night. And thus, we run into a greater possibility of a candidate wanting to argue that, look, I won. You see John King, he's got all the ballots. The election's over. And it's sort of been a little bit more hyper enlarged by statements that the president has made in 2016, where he said the election is absolutely rigged and it's done by dishonest media and at many polling places. And he said in 2016, although a lot of people don't seem to remember that if he loses, he may not want to accept the results because he thinks it's a rigged election unless he wins. And now he's saying the same thing in 2020. So we have this issue about counting and reporting that also goes back to the Bush-Gore campaign, particularly in Florida, about what votes were cast, what votes were counted, and ultimately we have the issue that the Supreme Court had to resolve what was going to happen in terms of who was going to be the president. On this very day that I'm giving the talk, we have a Supreme Court nominee up for consideration, and President Trump had put her in a very uncomfortable position by saying we have to have that last justice in place for the election so that the election court cases can go my way. Now, she never said that, Justice Barrett, but the president did, and it puts her in an awkward position. You also have the issue about channels like Fox News may wanting to grab an early victory and essentially deem or dub the president the winner. And then we also have the issue of the most recent presidential debate where when Donald Trump was asked about the Proud Boys, which is basically a white nationalist group and anti-Semitic group, he would not disavow them. And he also made the comment that they should stand back and stand by. So for a lot of people, they've become quite alarmed with what does that mean? Does that mean if the election doesn't go your way, we should be doing something? It's an open question, particularly when you take a look at the governor of Michigan, who was just involved in a potential kidnapping scenario by militia groups as well. So we live in very turbulent times. We also have to recognize that on election day, regardless of how we count the ballots, we still have to deal with the popular vote versus the Electoral College vote. And I know there's going to be another talk coming up on this, but basically in 2016, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by 3 million people, but still lost the Electoral College vote. And that was all caused by about 70,000 total votes in 3 states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. If you take a look at the Biden-Trump campaign right now, you'll see that Biden appears to be up considerably in terms of the Electoral College vote, and nationally in terms of the popular vote by perhaps 10%. So to summarize a lot of this, there's a limited difference between absentee ballots and mail-in ballots. Absentee ballots have to be requested. Universal mail-in ballots don't. In both cases, though, they have to be, the individual has to be registered and the information has to be verified by state officials. In New Jersey, nobody's going to get an actual voting machine to vote in. You're going to be handed a provisional ballot, and that's being done by Governor Murphy to make sure that they can check to make sure no other ballots were cast, and they can proof all of the ballots. Not all states are doing that. There's also internet voting. Presently, a few states allow people to vote on the internet, but it's right now limited to either military people or disabled people. New Jersey, Virginia, and Delaware are the 3 states that are most involved with that. And an organization called Democracy Live is really the pioneers in this area. Early voting basically is available in 80 states, so you can go and you can vote early. These are the states, the map here, that has early voting options, and you can see that Pennsylvania is not an early voting state per se. You can do in-person absentee ballots, but you'll see that the average period of time for voting is about 22 days before the election nationwide. Pennsylvania specifically has 50 days before the election to be able to vote in-person absentee, and you have to do it by 5 p.m. Prior to the first Tuesday before the election. In New Jersey, there's 45 days to do early voting, and it's also an in-person absentee, and it's 3 p.m. the day before the election. Mail and absentee ballots are processed differently. Particular concern for PA is that PA and Wisconsin both don't allow the state to open the ballots or even begin to process them before Election Day. So what that means is that PA's vote's going to come in late. When you watch John King, he's not really going to know who won Pennsylvania. If you look at Florida, they can do it before Election Day. So Florida is likely to have close to the final result. And states like Arizona, Georgia, Minnesota, Nevada are going to be able to count those states that are key battleground states as soon as they receive them. This is just a map that shows you the process, how early certain states can do it versus others. And if you look towards the top, Pennsylvania is right at Election Day. Florida, you could have begun to process votes in September. There's also a renewed interest with social media based upon post-Russian influence in 2016, and with a decline in the use of traditional media for political interests. Facebook and Twitter have been called out for their lack of action, but they are sort of stepping up in 2020. This is a page off of Facebook that gives voter information. So if you're looking for more information, you can go to Facebook and see this type of material there. Twitter is also saying that they're going to play a greater role in sort of trying to restrict politicians from being able to make untrue statements. These are the deadlines that Danuto had talked about. So the last day to register in PA is October 19th, which is this week. In New Jersey, if you're watching, you have to do it by today. These are the other days that are available. On Election Day, the polls are open from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. No one here, I assume, is a military person or overseas, so those are not so much in play. This just shows the distribution of mail-in ballots that can be put into drop boxes, satellite offices, and so forth. You can see that Philadelphia has a lot of both of them. Okay. And why are these dates important? And I'll sort of sum up with this right now, is that all of these dates, when we think about Election Day as being very important, if on Election Day we don't know who the winner is, it has to get resolved by December 14th, because that's when the electors to the Electoral College slate have to be determined for the state of Pennsylvania. That's when they go to Harrisburg and they cast their votes, and then they're sent by mail, funny, but by mail, to Congress, who opens them in January and sees if anyone got 270 votes. If no one got 270 votes in that January date, the House of Representatives delegations get to choose who the president is. So while the whole focus right now is about mail-in ballots and voting to beat the Election Day deadline, the next big date is December 14th. Okay. And this is where you can go to get more information if you're interested. Vote.org. There are also other sites, but if you go to this one, it'll track to issues for Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and all across the country. And Roosevelt just made the statement that said, basically, no one will ever deprive the American people of the right to vote except the American people themselves. And the only way to do this is by not voting. So I will stop there. I'll take a few questions if you have them. And it's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks so much, Bill. You can put your questions in chat. I think there are some. Stacy's going to handle those first, and then if we have no others, we'll open it up to the audience.
Yes, there are a few questions. Oops, sorry, there are a few questions, and I think Bill has until about 4:15 for anyone who's interested in and able to stay after. So I will start to go through the list. If you have some, please just type them in. All right, so the first one is, does the act of writing in candidates on mail-in ballots cause a delay in counting? What about ballots in which write-in candidates have been used for the local candidates, but not the national?
It's a good question. I would have to assume that write-in votes will make a big difference in the speed at which votes are counted. The problem there is that a person can write in whatever name they want. So on the ballot itself, you're going to have probably 3 or 4 names that are there, but the write-ins could be all across the board. In fact, when I watched John Bolton the other day ranting and railing against Donald Trump, he said that he's going to write in a name of another Republican. He will not vote for Joe Biden. But if each person chose an individual, it's a sort of a very deliberate process where you have to write it down, you have to count it, and then you have to send it in. So it would slow it down. In terms of lower down ballots, to be frank with you, I don't think anyone is particularly concerned about that because eventually they will be counted in the next few days. I think most of the attention, though, is on the presidential race.
Thank you. Then the next one is, how long do you think it will take to really get the winner? Will it take more than a week? We have no ballot boxes here in Arizona. I mailed mine at the post office and got notice from the county that it was verified by my signature and was counted.
Okay, so my assumption is that if Donald Trump has the ability to get the election close, it will take quite some time to be able to determine the winner. If it becomes a runaway election, in many ways it won't matter. This happened in 2000 because once the number of votes exceeded the difference between the two candidates, they essentially stopped counting. Okay, now it's not a very good democratic theory to have it that way, but from a practical standpoint, it's not going to make any difference. So my odds-on bet is that on election night, if you see Florida and Pennsylvania both go strong for Joe Biden, the election is over, although it may not be declared over. The actual vote count, though, has to be finalized by December 14th, as I said, for the electors. And part of the strategy, and I'm not trying to say this in a negative way about the president, but part of his strategy may be to have that drawn out so far that he can then just declare a national emergency and say that we can't count that election and we may have to do a redo, or I may just have to stay in office. That's something that the Democrats greatly fear. So they're going to try and make sure that their voters show up on election day. But I would say it's safe to say that we won't have a relatively firm number for at least a week.
All right, thank you. Then another question. Would you be able to explain what the issue was with some mismarking of mail-in ballots, I believe in New York State, and if that has been rectified? And does the mismarking of mail-in ballots create the opportunity for fraud?
Well, there's a couple of issues there. I'm not sure exactly what the person is referring to, but you're not allowed to put any stray marks on a mail-in ballot. So you can't write, a name or a word or a reminder to yourself or whatever. It has to be a clean ballot except for the places that are designed to capture information. So if that happens, that ballot can be declared non-usable, okay? It could be a non-countable ballot. And that's the point I made earlier, that if you actually go to the polling booth, even if you're given a provisional ballot, the person can answer questions that may stop some of those issues from occurring. You also have the issue that you're supposed to, in some states, get a signature of another person as a witness that you actually did the ballot. So what happens is that if that is not done properly, see, there's an envelope inside of an envelope. They don't open the most inner envelope until they're certain that they have a legitimate ballot that's been cast properly. That could also be a disposed ballot and not counted as well. The problem is, as I mentioned in the very beginning of my talk, is that 50 states have probably 42 different mechanisms on how this is handled.
Great, thank you. And then there's one more for now, at least. I've been under the impression that networks use exit polls and other ways outside of announced ballot counts to estimate when candidates have won a state or a district election. Is it possible to predict mail-in votes in any similar way to that, to exit polls?
Well, a friend of mine actually works for the networks on election day to work up the voting projections. What happens is that under normal circumstances, when you watch the news, you see a poll by NBC or in the New York Times or Quinnipiac or whatever, and a lot of times they're 1,200 person polls. And those polls have a sampling error of about plus or minus 3%, which means basically if one, let's say Biden had 53%, he could be as high as 56 or as low as 50. The problem is that that's a national poll. It doesn't really tell you what's happening, let's say, in New York or Pennsylvania or New Jersey, where there may only be 87 people from Pennsylvania voting. The sampling error is going to be really large in an 87 person bucket, okay? So you're not going to be able to make real good statements about what's going on. So what the networks do is rather than do those 1,200 person surveys, they do a survey in which they band together with a lot of other media and polling organizations and do about a 17,000 person study so that they have a lot more people in a lot of states so that they can be more precise in their estimate of what's going on. In addition, it's not necessarily totally a random sample when they're doing these projections because they know that certain areas are going to go one way or the other no matter what. So not to make people from Pennsylvania or New Jersey or any other state saddened, but if you're a voter in New Jersey, the likelihood that your vote's going to make a difference in the outcome of an election is really small because New Jersey basically votes in presidential races for the Democrat. The same thing happens in Kansas, okay? That the vote in Kansas is going to overwhelmingly be Republican. We often use these terms about swing states. That's really where they want to see what's going to go on. And they're doing extensive research and looking at what's happened in the past. They're getting reporting from exit polls as well as those big national polls to see whether or not the trend is looking different than it has in the future. And that's what they use along with that big 17,000 person survey to try and estimate who is winning or who will win the election.
All right, and then I see it's 10 after, but there is one more question. Do you have time to take it, Bill? Do you want to hear it?
Sure.
What are your thoughts on Texas limiting election drop boxes to 1 per county? Democrats are saying this is voter suppression. However, this is a reliable red state.
Well, I may be incorrect, but my understanding is it's not 1 per county in all counties. I think the 1 per county issue was about a county called Harris County. And it's kind of reprehensible that they would go and they would limit it to such a small number. I believe that other counties are not that low, but still the idea is one of voter suppression, that they're trying to diminish the opportunity for certain portions of the public not to have the ability to cast their ballot. And as I mentioned in the very beginning of my talk today, the best way to combat that is to put on a mask, to put a pair of gloves on, and show up on election day, because you don't have to worry whether or not the ballots got lost. You don't have to worry about someone taking the voting box away. your vote counts on that day. Now, I realize there's risks associated with it, but that's sort of my best bet on how to go. And I myself am going to do that personally. I'm going to show up on election day and I'm going to cast my ballot.
All right, those are all the questions we have, and I think that's all the time that you have, Bill. So if no one has anything else, I want to thank you very much and thank everyone for attending. Please attend some of our upcoming events. I'll give you the link in the chat, as well as some of the other university events that we're doing around elections and voting. So thank you again.
It was a pleasure to talk to all of you. Take care.
Thanks so much, Bill. And join us for the next one next week.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Stay
Thank you.
safe.